Welcome to Yoga, Hype, and History. Today we're going to be talking about Hatha Yoga in the medieval period, which is a little odd to just say in the medieval period because this type of Hatha Yoga that we're looking at does persist up to this day and is the type of practice that is done by most sort of active yogis in India that are living this sort of renunciate yogi lifestyle as opposed to the modern postural yoga lifestyle or the meditative world of the Sankhya dualist Patanjali Yoga Sutras kind of yoga person. So let's get started today. We have some pretty interesting material. And one of the fun things about this material is a lot of the people that we're studying today and the authors that we read are people I know. Some of them I know pretty darn well, which is that's fun for me, I guess. So Hatha Yoga, or as I'm going to call it, pushing yoga, and I'll tell you why in a second. So Hatha Yoga sort of it means like the violent or the forceful exertion. So if I was to say Mama Padena Hatena Hatayet, that would mean I kick it with my foot violently. So from the Sanskrit hat, which means like a forceful thing. It can also mean to strike. So Hatha Yoga begins in the 12th century, really gets going in the 12th century CE, and reaches its fruition in the 15th century with the text called the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the little light on Hatha, which is still a prominent text. So this type of yoga is the most prominent type of yogis to this day, of sort of wandering renunciate yogis like this guy we see on our left. So this is actually a living tradition. It's not dead, unlike, say, the Yoga Sutras, which was revitalized in the 19th and 20th century, but became something new. This type of Hatha Yoga that we're going to see practiced really is not, ancient per se. A lot of the people that first started studying this, like James Malinson, will argue that he at one point thought that this type of yoga was ancient and just hadn't been written down. But the more he looked at the text, the more he looked at them, he thinks it really got started around the year 1000 and really only got going around the year 1200. So it's not exactly a Johnny come lately. It's still quite old. But it's not, you wouldn't say that this is identical to what the sages were doing in the forests in Jainism and Buddhism. So in the 20th century, and I remember this, especially in the 80s, and looking back at yoga writings from the 70s and remembering yoga programming from the 70s, like at the YMCA and whatnot, in this 20th century, most physical yoga that was performed in the West was called Hatha Yoga. And this was what developed into what we see now to be modern postural yoga. And when people would say Hatha Yoga, they would say it's the gentle way. But Hatha means the violent way or the forceful way. So they would say it means the gentle way and the exact opposite of what it actually was, of what the word actually means, which was always really striking to me once I started really learning Sanskrit. The other interesting argument you'll hear is Hatha is the way of the hand. Now, Hat in Hindi does mean hand, but the word in Sanskrit for hand is hasta, not Hatha. So that doesn't really connect in any way. So the gentle way, the yoga of the hand, all of that is sort of a secondary revision. It's something that, contemporary yoga people have reframed yoga to mean that's not there in the actual meanings. So Hatha Yoga has little to do with Patanjali or the Yoga Sutras, doesn't really make any reference to Patanjali or the Yoga Sutras. They're doing something else, and they have their own body of texts that are only recently being studied. This is a method that takes up the so-called subtle body of Tantra Yoga. So I'll talk about this more explicitly, but there's an idea that you have a network of channels and wheels or chakras, and channels or nadis that go throughout your body. And those are which prana, life force, flows through, and you can manipulate those energies. So that idea of the yogic body, some people might say, or the subtle body, comes directly out of the tantras. You don't find any of that in the earlier yoga texts. You definitely don't find them in the Yoga Sutras. They also take up ideas from Ayurveda about balancing the body. Ayurveda argues you have three humors, is what we call. So they would be bile, phlegm, so shleshma, pitta, and vaya, vayu, which is winds. So when these are imbalanced, your body is ill. So you need to consume foods that help you balance that. So this is found to some degree in Hatha Yoga, that you're trying to balance the body to create swadha, which they would call health, but it's not health like we have as a positive state of healthiness. It's this notion of health is just creating a body that's balanced and is free of imbalances which cause disease and ultimately cause death. For lack of, I mean, that's a simplification. They also connect this Hatha Yoga and Hatha Yogis, connect yoga to asceticism. Remember, we would talk about tapas, the generation of holy heat. So guys would hold their arms up forever, or stand on one leg and stare at the sun, or hang upside down. The idea is you do those austerities, and that builds tapas, or this inner heat within you that will transform you. And if you're very powerful with it, you can even force the gods to grant you good wishes. But you'll notice when you look at these Hatha Yogis today, they'll do things like standing on their heads in the heat of the sun and they'll take cow patties, so dried cow manure, around them, which is usually used to start fires in India and in South Asia, and they'll light them on fire. So in the hottest blazes of the day, standing upside down, I'll show you a picture of this, with a ring of fire around them. There's another meaning of the Johnny Cash song, I fell into a burning ring of fire. Well, I stood on my head in a burning ring of fire. I went down, down, down. The flames went higher. And it burns, 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 the ring of fire. But in the end, it's not the fire of love that Johnny Cash was talking about. They're talking about these fires externally and internally that burn impurities and create this transforming body. All right, so metaphors of the subtle body here also involve manipulation of what I call the inner hydraulics. So you turn the sexual fluids into divine nectars by reversing downward motions, by pushing fluids upward or standing on one head. Pump it up. So the thing is, our natural bodies, male or female, we have semen is created and is ejaculated. Uterine blood, which is considered sexual fluid in South Asia, or vaginal secretions of any sort, are also considered as retas, or sexual fluid. The idea is they naturally flow down and out, but if you retain them and push them up your spine, they will be transmuted into nectar in your head that will give you magic powers or liberation. To add to this, you can just stand on your head, and maybe the very gravity of the earth will change this. And I have read Hatha Yoga manuals that talk about this. It's all about standing on the head. Okay, so this, in addition to these physical practices, Hatha Yoga is a meditative practice that's supported by physical postures and exercise postures. They have two names for this. So they'll do like 4 bodily postures and hold them for a really long time. They're not doing like 20 postures in sequence like you see in modern postural yoga. The idea is that the postures help the body remain strong and support the body in doing meditation. So the postures are good for and support meditation. Okay, so what is the goal of this? The goal of this meditative practice, that is supported by these bodily activities, is to gain immortality in your body, which obviously that doesn't happen because we don't have immortal people running around, or maybe we do, we just haven't met them. Also to gain magic powers and or gain moksha, or liberation, freedom from the cycle of worldly existence. There is no real notion of health like we see it. If we're talking about bodily immortality, it's not about being free from disease. It's more about transmuting the body, going from man to God man, if you will. So that's a very alchemical notion of things. So let's get into the details. The information that we read today by Malinson and Singleton, for that matter, and Daniela Bevilacqua and Jason Birch comes out of a a 21st century project called the Hatha Yoga Project. So Birch, Malinson, and Bevilacqua were all engaged in this European multi-year research group called the Hatha Yoga Project. And this gathered a wide range of handwritten manuscripts to reconstruct the history of Hatha Yoga. So you can look and see that stack of manuscripts there. I think Jason took that picture, in fact. Anyway, so they collected all these manuscripts and they created critical editions of these texts that had never been published, let alone translated before. But they also got Daniela Bevilacqua to come in and do ethnographic research. Now, I know Bevilacqua speaks Hindi, James Malinson speaks Hindi very well, so they would wander around and actually talk to yogis and try to understand what these living traditions that look like outside of the straight text. Malinson and Birch, of course, worked on the Sanskrit critical editions, and you see this table of people sitting around. I know about half of them. And those are people sitting around reading a critical edition, working out the translation. Because when you do this kind of textual work, you need to do it with other people because one set of eyes will miss stuff. Anyway, so it was a big project, and they've got another one going now, which is really exciting. So several of these characters, especially Birch and Malinson, are yoga practitioners themselves. James Malinson is an initiate of a Hatha Yoga order. In fact, I'll show you a picture of this. He was given the honor of being called a Mahant. So he's a leader in a very specific Hatha Yoga order, but he's not a renunciate. He's a married British guy, but he's lived in India on and off for a very long time. And like I said, he's an authority in an Indian order, and he may be the only white person who's ever done that. So out of this project comes a wide range of cutting edge studies and translations that are fascinating. So in contrast to modern postural yoga, Hatha Yoga is old. Modern postural yoga is 19th, 20th century, but Hatha Yoga was beginning to be practiced in the 12th century and really gets big in the 15th century. We can find elements of it going back further, but that's really what's going on here. Until recently, the majority of important texts on Hatha Yoga were only found in handwritten manuscripts. So on palm leaf, on paper, on birch bark. These be written by hand, anywhere from 100 to 500 years ago. And this is what the majority of Sanskrit manuscripts look like. They're not printed books like you would think of books to this day, which would be called codexes. But we don't need to go into those details. Anyway, so very few of these important texts had been edited or translated or even published. This study reviewed this Hatha Yoga project. This study revealed and preserved a wide range of texts and made them available to scholars and practitioners. Birch, in particular, wandered around India for several years securing copies of manuscripts. And this is where I first met him. I met him in Nepal, and we've hung out in a couple of different places, in Pondicherry and in Pune. He travels with his wife, who's also a fantastic yoga practitioner and becoming a scholar in and of herself. And Jason Birch was just going around to all these manuscript libraries and trying to find these very specific, finding the oldest versions of these manuscripts so he could bring them back to Britain and they could edit them together and publish them. I, at the time, was doing similar work, going to similar archives, but I was looking for magical texts. And I remember he and I consuming a lot of new coconuts and chatting late into the night about the different types of texts we were studying. Jason Birch is a very interesting character. I asked him one time, how did you get into yoga? And he told me that, and he's an Australian guy, he said he got really sick at one point in his life and he decided to try yoga and he got better. And I mean, I don't practice yoga when I'm with him. I've watched him do his yoga routines. They're pretty darn impressive. Okay, so we're looking at scholar practitioners here in kind of the best possible terms because they're rigorous scholars like Malinson and Birch are. Bevilacqua is not an initiate into any type of yoga tradition, and we'll read her later, and she talks about why that's actually important for her. These are scholar practitioners in the best possible sense of the term, that they combine lived experience, interviewing actual living practicing yogis, and rigorous textual research. So the tradition of Hatha Yoga practice spans centuries and teachers. And various disciples, most of whom never studied or were even aware of the text. What am I saying? Yogi practitioners, very few of them read these texts. They put most of their value on their own experiences that were mediated by an accomplished guru. They had a teacher. The teacher was a part of a religious order. They were initiated by their teacher into that religious order. They didn't sit around, read texts, and then go practice yoga. The guru told them, this is what you do. And then it's like, okay, I'll go do that. And then they go back to the guru and says, this is what you do next. So they weren't working out of these textual manuals per se. So in this tradition, they practice body positions to strengthen and tone the body so that it can support the mental practices which will cause liberation. Though in the past, these same practices and some yogi martial arts were performed to prepare the body for mercenary work in these yogi mercenary armies I've talked about. The life and lifestyle is difficult, so strong body is required to support it. Note that the body in Hatha Yoga here is not reviled in contrast to the spirit. So what do I mean to say like that? Well, you think about in Christianity and in a lot of Western traditions, the body is considered bad. The spirit must be evolved to transcend the body and go to the heavens. In yoga, and Hatha Yoga, the body is a means to transcend the body. The body is a means by which to do their religious practice. Like I said, the ultimate result of Hatha Yoga is bodily immortality and magic powers, or a realization of the true self, though the bodily perfection was the most common goal. And I think they maintain, even though they wouldn't say they're practitioners of Sankhya, I'd say there's a lot of Sankhya in what Hatha Yogis do. So while some modern postural yogis say they practice Hatha Yoga, which I said can be called the gentle way or the hand, which is ridiculous, they're really deriving themselves from 20th century practices. Modern postural yoga practitioners are not deriving themselves from the stuff that these yogis do. And yogis, it's interesting. A lot of scholars have talked and they're like, oh, it's really kind of cool that you guys are kind of doing yoga, but you're not doing it like we're doing yoga. So it's interesting that even these yogis, if they have some knowledge that people are doing yoga, they look at them and go, that's good, but they're not doing what we're doing. So there are practices by a yoga guru named Bhikkhya Iyengar and his students, and they say that what they do is Ashtanga yoga or Hatha yoga. But again, what they're doing looks nothing like what these living practitioners of a tradition perform. So Hatha yoga that I'm talking about here is the practices of Hatha Yogins, Hatha Yogis in India, primarily the practices of renunciate members of religious orders. Renunciates, they've left their family, they've taken on a new name, but there are a few householders. Like James Malinson is a member of one of these orders, and he's a householder. He's married and has children. So Hatha Yoga involves bodily practices and some postures, but the postures are older and a lot less complicated than you see in modern postural yoga. Yoga practices are thought to be used in addition and as support of non-asana practice, non-postural practices. All of this makes use of the body. When they're doing mental practices, they're still manipulating the body. So the body is not denied in Hatha Yoga. So what is Hatha Yoga? And I've alluded to this a bit. The term means forceful or violent. Now, there's an esoteric meaning that Ha means like the sun and Ta means the moon. And Hatha is the union of the sun and the moon. This was not common in many texts. Actually, we find that the first use of the term Hatha and Hatha Yoga is found actually in an early Buddhist source, a source that was thought to be a Shaiva source until these very scholars were really looking at it and went, oh, this is actually a Buddhist source. So in one sense, this term Hatha Yoga does originate from Buddhism, but became very much a Hindu thing. Okay, so Hatha Yoga is the forceful union, this is my definition, that mostly focuses on the retention and manipulation of the bindu. Bindu means a dot or an essential thing or an atom. So the bindu, which is actually here, semen in the body. Semen is pushed upward instead of downward. So while Tantra, and we'll talk more about Tantra as we go along, while Tantra has an argument that you perform tantric practices to transform the soul and push it up and outward, yoga is different. It wants to take these fluids in the body, which would also correspond to like sort of subtle energies, and push them up. It's not about up and out. It's just about up. And as it moves up, stuff happens. So this is why I call it the yoga of pushing. Like I said, and I'll say it again, it starts around the 12th century. And the manipulation of semen in this way, pushing it up to create nectar in the head, stretches way back and can also be found in our discussion of tapasya, or heat-generating austerities from earlier times. Yes, but it's really taking on, Hatha Yoga here is taking on ideas in Tantra that are also about this manipulation of interior body channels, which none of that you can find in the Yoga Sutras or in Samkhya. So the imaginal body, or the subtle body, the imagined internal body, or the soul body, or anything, consists of energy flows called nadis, which is the same word for river, and channels that include energy symbols that are symbolized as, or energy centers that are symbolized as wheels or lotuses, from which we get the word chakra. That's not chakra, Chakra is a word for the god Indra. You don't want to call it, you don't want Indra in you. We have wheels or energy channels. Chakra just means wheel. So chakra, not chakra. I don't know why everybody wants to say chakra, probably because of the way C's and A's work in English. Anyway, so you have these wheels and lotuses and energy channels, and you have locks or bandhus, so you can manipulate these wheels and energy channels are also connected to the breath, and you can lock them in certain positions by sort of like clenching parts of your body or visualizing. So it's all about manipulating these subtle energies in the body, and also these not so subtle sort of like physical things such as semen or uterine blood that you're pushing up your spine. Okay, so like I said, Hatha Yoga manipulates this bindu or semen or retas, that means seed, or vaginal substances, and it manipulates the bindu, the semen, and the energy flows or prana or life winds. It also, because it's being derived from Tantra, awakens a thing called Kundalini. Kundalini just means the coiled one, which means the condensed and coiled snake energy, and it's always described as being a snake, that lies coiled up at the base of kind of your belly by your genitals. And as you work at it, it opens its head and transmutes itself up your spine, up and outward, transforming the self coming through. Kundalini, the coiled one. When you hear about Kundalini yoga, in fact, that's actually derived from the 20th century and a Sikh guru who we'll talk about a little bit later. But it resonates with this, but this whole Kundalini business is very India. We'll get into it a little bit more later. So here again, we see that Hatha really derives much of its specific practices and metaphysics from Tantra. But it takes all the Tantra ritual, because we're going to look, when we look at Tantra, we'll see there's tons and tons of ritual about it. They take the ritual out and they just do the bodily practices and the meditation without external ritual supports. As that Kundalini rises and uncoils, it progressively liberates, grants bodily perfection and magical powers. So it takes out the ritual and it makes the ritual enacted in the body, or removes the rituals at all and only focuses on bodily practices. So Hatha Yoga can also be called somatized or somatized Tantra. So Tantra that is done in the body. Now, Jason Birch, here's a nice picture of him, argues, and this is in an Indian manuscript archive. So, and he works this into his Hatha Yoga article that we read today. Rather than the metaphysical explanation of uniting the sun, Ha, and the moon, Ta, it is more likely that the name Hatha Yoga was inspired by the meaning force. The descriptions of forcefully moving Kundalini, Apana, or Bindu upward through the central channel, which is called the Sushumna along the sign, suggests that the force of Hatha Yoga qualifies the effects of its techniques rather than the effort required to perform them. So he's making a critique here. He's saying that when people call Hatha Yoga the violent exertion, it's done that way because it's violent and difficult, which very much sounds like the critiques of yogis that a lot of the British said, like they're doing these crazy asceticisms and body mortification. It's all bad. It's all violent. It's all Hatha. He's saying that the Hatha of Hatha Yoga requires the effort, the forceful effort to move all of these fluids and energies up the spine. It's not that you're doing violence or you're acting in a violent way or you're harming the body. It's that you're forcefully manipulating the body. So here's a real quick brief history of text, just to go over it real fast. There are 4 distinctive periods of yoga in India. The early stage consists of the renunciate traditions and ascetic practices that we find in the Upanishads, the Hindu texts, the Buddhist texts, and Jainism. These are tapas generators, people that are generating the interior heat through austerity. So this is the earliest status. Then in the 2nd, or probably the 4th or 5th century, we find Patanjali Yoga Sutras. So this is the yoga that is coming out of the understanding of Sankhya, that's, kind of early, like, up to about 400 or 500 CE. Then Hatha Yoga gets going in the 12th century and matures in the 5th century. And this is a tradition that persists amongst yogis today. And finally, this 4th stage, which will be the 3rd part of our class, is modern postural yoga. And in modern postural yoga, there's a germ, there's like a seed of Hatha Yoga asana practices by yogis, but they lay on top of it ideas in culture, ideas of the body in the West, and then they proliferate all sorts of different body positions. And they do some breathing stuff. We find that yogis actually do a lot of manipulations of breathings, but there's some of that in modern postural yoga. And we also see this argument that if you put yoga positions together, do them in a sequence, they'll bring about health and strength. But there's no real discussion of meditation or mental practices, or what we're going to see at the end of this lecture, the preliminaries of cleansing the body that we looked at in our discussion forums. Okay. So we only see self-described Hatha Yoga in the 15th century with a text called Hatha Yoga Pradipika. We do find evidence of prior sources that call themselves Raja Yoga, which we talked about before. And in these Raja Yoga texts, they say that Hatha Yoga is bad. It's superfluous. It's too oriented toward the body. It's too hard. It's too dangerous. That's what Raja Yoga would say about Hatha Yoga. Now, in the West, early descriptions of Hatha Yoga were describing self-torture, conflating yoga practices with sadhus performing mortifications and harsh vows, like only walking, never taking a motorized car, never lying down, holding your arm up like this guy until his arm atrophies. Look at his long nails. So these are not really found in the text, but they're part of an ancient tradition of merit-making tapasya, or ascetic heat, that stretches back to the times of the Buddhas. Now, remember that these yogi, or that people first looking at Hatha Yoga didn't have access to the text that we're looking at today, and that the people looking at it were mostly colonists who resisted yogis. Why? Because they had these yogi armies that would mess with them, and they considered them criminals, but also functional mercenaries. So in the 12th century, we find all sorts of types of mentions of yogas. They have a mantra yoga, they have laya yoga, which is considered a yoga of disillusioning meditation, which I'm not going to go to in this class, and Hatha Yoga. Raja Yoga was actually well represented in texts, and it claimed to be higher than all the other yogas. And Jason Birch is the first one to really discover this, and this wide range of Raja Yoga. Now, this is not the Raja Yoga of Swami V. It's much more meditative than Hatha Yoga, but it's not the purely mental sitting in a chair yoga that we see in Swami Vivekananda's thinking. So what is Raja Yoga? And if you see this picture here, I swear that is not me. That is not me in that picture. Though I've definitely hung out in groups like this before. So the guy in gray is not me, though I swear I've met that guy somewhere. He looks really familiar. Anyway, so Raja Yoga here is not to be confused with modern descriptions of Raja Yoga. And remember that Raja Yoga means the king of yogas, or the kingly yoga, or the yoga of kings, in fact. So don't confuse it with modern Raja Yoga that were not traced to any Sanskrit source and are really just a mental, non-physical yoga advanced in the 19th and 20th centuries by yoga teachers, Western and Indian, but especially by Swami Vivekananda. Raja Yoga here, what I'm describing, is a mental yoga consisting of the mental limbs of Patanjali Yoga. So leaving out the yamas and the niyamas and the asanas and the pranayamas, you have the dharana, which is the concentration, the pratyahara, which is withdrawal, sensory isolation. Then you have concentrate, your meditation, dhyana, and samadhi, that all liberating union, for lack of a better word. Okay, so Raja Yoga here is a mental yoga consisting of the mental limbs of Patanjali Yoga and stressing the attainment and practice of samadhi. It is thought to be non-strenuous, even effortless. As a complete system, it is argued that it and only it would bring about liberation, and Hatha Yoga or Laya Yoga or Mantra Yoga wouldn't do it. Its full practice involves initiation and instruction from a guru. And then the goal of the practice of Raja Yoga is that you sit comfortably, remain still, and gaze into empty space. And in times, that gaze will become internal and the mind will dissolve. Now, if you know much about the meditative traditions, this sounds like a lot of meditative practices. In the Tibetan, it sounds like Dzogchen. In Mahayana Buddhism, it sounds like Mahamudra. So this type of meditation can be found throughout Indic religions. All right, so Hatha with exertion is said to be destructive and not to give the fruits of liberation. Remember, Swami Vivekananda said the same thing. This Hatha Yoga is actually dangerous and will not give you liberation. Raja Yoga will argue that Raja Yoga is the best for its aspirants. Mantra yoga, bhakti yoga, so devotional yoga is for mediumly qualified. Raja Yoga is for the best aspirants, and Hatha Yoga is for the lowest aspirants. This is common rhetoric in yoga and in Sanskritic culture. You make your thing that you're advancing into the biggest thing, and things that come before or your rivals, you say, are just a step on the ladder of accomplishment upon which your thing is at the top. Some argue this is called hierarchical entrenchment, but we don't need to get into that term. So, in the 15th century, the Hatha Pradipika, the little lamp on Hatha, resolves the rivalry between Raja Yoga and Hatha Yoga, and Raja Yoga sort of fades away in the 15th century, with Hatha Yoga just kind of becoming dominant. So there might have been a whole system in which the practice of Hatha gets the results of Raja Yoga. They will argue that without Hatha, the Raja Yoga is unattainable, and without Raja Yoga, then the full practice of Hatha Yoga is fruitless. So the Hatha Pradipika argues that you need Raja to get Hatha, you need Hatha to get Raja. So they're actually connected, they argue. Full-on Hatha Yoga, resembling this 15th century text, the Hatha Pradipika, is what is described that yogis practice to this day in India. Now, we're moving back to the preliminaries of yogic practice, which we read about in Roots of Yoga. So I'm just going to kind of review these, and then we'll be done for the day. So what are the preliminary practices of Hatha Yoga? And remember, what are your preliminary practices or your requirements to do modern postural yoga? You need a mat, you need some money, you need a yoga studio, you need somebody to teach you, maybe. I remember my friend Milena in Mysore. I was asking her, are you going out to yoga classes? She's like, why? I can do yoga in my own room. I know these positions. What do I get out of going to a studio? It's just smelling other people's farts. I can do yoga in my room without smelling other people's farts. So what are the things for modern postural yoga? You need, like I said, you need some money for the yoga class. You need a place to go. You need a mat. You need a jug of water. You need your fancy yoga clothes, whatever. You're not hanging out in a loincloth with burning poop all around you. Okay. So what's one of the first preliminaries we read about in Roots of Yoga? Well, the yogi should find a pleasant place to build a hut, like these ones I have pictured here. There he should eat good food and proper food and dedicate himself to the practices. Now, in practice, we find that they would often reside in small groups with their gurus. So they wouldn't, yogis, and when you see yogis today, you'll see them traveling alone, but they really do tend to hang out in a small group with their guru, and they kind of live together. What else? Well, we have these so-called shatkarmanis. So one should engage in these cleansing practices as a preliminary before yoga practices, and you should be doing these all the time. They will not only make the body clean, but balance the body's inner constituents. So balancing out the flows and the changes and the forces in the body. These practices are called the 6 actions, or shatkarma. This is possibly a reworking of the name shatkarman for the magic rituals that I'll talk about in a later thing. That's my research. Or the shatanga, the 6 limbs of yoga. But it's hard to say. In fact, they're called the shatkarmani, but like any list of 6 things, they could say these are the shatkarmani, and here's 99 of these darn things. All right, but we're going to look at a few of them. So texts contain a wide range of these practices and variants upon them. The main thing to remember is that this is a body preparation that people do in order to support the physicalized practices. So in order to support your body positions, but also to cleanse the body to support the mind. One thing you'll notice in here is so many of these are connected to the alimentary canal. What do I mean by alimentary canal? I mean mouth to butt, your whole system, your whole digestive system in its entirety. Okay, so what are these? Well, you have Dauti. That cleans the intestines by progressively swallowing a long piece of white cloth from the mouth until it passes all the way through the rectum and out the anus. Now, I've seen people do this. You'll see them, and sometimes I knew one guy who would do it with like about 6 meters of cloth. So that's like 18 feet. And he would like kind of make a little ball, and he'd swallow the first one, and he would progressively over a long period of time swallow the entirety of it as the rest of the cloth gets moving through his whole body. It's kind of gnarly to watch. Basti. So basti is squatting in the water and drawing up and expelling the water from the anus. This may also involve prolapsing and washing the rectum. So you'd squat in the water and you basically would kind of suck up water into your anus and then into one's own anus and then expel it out, sort of like a, I don't know, it's like an enema of sort. Now, these are not described as the Shatkarmani that you would find in a modern yoga studio. These are a little different, but we find these in lots and lots of texts. And I'm quoting here from Malinson's treatment on Hatha Yoga that we read about in the Encyclopedia of Hinduism. So that's basti. So that's sort of drawing up and expelling water. Neti, which we should all know, it's like a neti pot, is nasal flossing, or as they say, nasal lavage, by passing cotton from the nose to the mouth originally, but also nasal lavage, which is pouring water down your nose until it comes out your mouth. Traptaka cleanses the eyes by staring at a small object until the eyes water. So if you like stare at one thing till your eyes water, that's to sort of like flush any impurities out of your eyes. Nauli, and you can see interesting YouTubes of Nauli, is abdominal churning, in which the stomach muscles are contracted and then shifted side to side. So you like suck your gut in, your diaphragm, and then they build up their muscle strength so they can actually shift their stomach muscles from side to side and even in a circular motion. Kapalabhati, this is breathing in and out of the nose, pumping the body like bellows. This is kind of similar to pranayama, but a little different. I remember having one teacher that I shared a hotel room with, and I woke up in the morning and I heard him just go, and he's like air in his nose, out his mouth, and his mouth as a part of his meditation practice, and it freaked me out. I woke up like, what is that sound? Okay, Gajakarani cleanses the stomach by drinking and vomiting water, so that's very delightful. Gaja means elephant, so that's kind of like being like an elephant. I assume that would be in reference to an elephant's trunk sucking up water and then blowing it out. And finally, chakri from chakra, a wheel, which involves rotating the finger inserted into the anus until it relaxes the muscles there, which is thought to cleanse the body and also thought to just kind of balance everything out. So these are some of your 6 results. We also have mudras. So these are things that are very common in these early texts and ways to get ready to do yoga and to do during yoga. So mudra means seal, S-E-A-L, and they refer to like hand gestures. Like, so this one means abhaya mudra, have no fear. But here, mudras are seals and they are practices. These generally have to do in the head. So these are practices to retain and raise and manipulate the bindu, the semen once again. They involve getting in specific body positions and manipulating the body to change the flow of the bindu, like standing upside down your head, the Viparita asana. We think some of the oldest are standing on the head positions that reverse the bodily flow. This also includes various techniques to raise kundalini that include the Kachari, Vajroli, and even pulling of the tongue activity. So, the Kachari Mudra. It's something like that. You stick your tongue way out, you cross your eyes, do a thing with your nose, and sometimes you put a thing with your ear, and then there's all sorts of stuff in the Kachari Mudra. Sometimes it's you put your tongue in the top of the roof of your mouth and like push up on your soft palate. That's also one of those things. There's also a thing where you actually pull on your tongue, and that causes that tongue to like sort of raise this awareness here, and then supposedly pulling on the tongue will cause that coiled kundalini, which is, I guess, connected to your tongue, to kind of extend up your spine. This isn't purely asana, though there are body positions. Something like asana plus more stuff. Breath work is called kumbhaka. Kumbhaka means a pot. So this involves specific practices for inhalation and exhalation. Like the most common one is you take your fingers like this. Well, it depends on your tradition. You go in one nostril, out the other. In, out. This is really common in yogic practices. And it's thought to balance sort of, there's thought to be 3 energy channels. Your Shushumna, which is your central channel, and then the Ida and the Pingala, which are the left and right. And they kind of go like this in your body. And by breathing in and out, by alternating there, it's thought to balance those. Okay, so one sets up the body into a mudra or a lock and inhales or exhales from different nostrils or while holding the mouth in a certain way. There's a notion that stopping the breath also stops the mind, so holding the breath activities, which will stop the semen and bindu as well. I remember reading in a Hatha Yoga manual I got in India in the 90s that it said never hold your breath because it's really, really bad for you. And they had this yoga manual had a combination of like Western physiology and anatomy and sort of traditional Indic stuff. And they were like, don't hold your breath. But when you look, there's in these yoga texts, there's a whole lot of activities that involve holding the breath. So this is sort of this breath work, or kundaka is related, or kumbhaka is related to pranayama. Pranayama is the exercise of the breath or life force, both of which use the manipulation to make changes in the body and to bring about powerful experiences. Asana. All right. The dreaded asanas, the main thing that we see in modern postural yoga. Well, early texts usually advance about 15 body positions, some of which are common with contemporary modern postural yoga. The body positions are held for a long period of time, and that's meant to build up the body or even support meditation. In the lore of Hatha Yoga, you'll see that there's said to be 84 body positions or 84,000 body positions or asanas, but there are a few texts that have that many positions, and there's no agreed upon 80. They'll all say, oh, there's 84, and then the list like 12. And then there's no agreement on what those 84 positions are. The traditional body positions are, in fact, the springboard for the asana innovations and proliferations that we see in the 20th century. The first text that we find that actually teaches a full 84 positions is found in the 17th century. So that's pretty darn late. So Jim Malinson writes, and here is a picture of James Malinson being initiated as a mahant in his religious order, because he is a part of an order of yogis. He says, in the Hatha Yoga, or in the Hatha Pradipika, the little light on yoga, asana is said to lead to steadiness, health, and suppleness. Aims that are not dissimilar from those of modern yoga, but I would say that health in yogic culture is different in the West and in the East. Certain individual asanas, or body positions, are said therein and in other texts to awaken kundalini, destroy disease, make the breath enter the central channel, and increase the digestive power, the digestive fire. Digestion in the body is thought to be a fire. So when you eat, as your body digests, it's thought to burn up the fire that is compared to sacrificial offerings. Okay, so, but who are these practitioners? And here's a picture of Daniela Bevilacqua, who came to the Hatha Yoga Project a little bit later, but she's just a brilliant anthropologist, really prolific. I had pizza with her a few years back, and she's really got a great grasp on what these contemporary yogis are doing. And despite being a Western woman, she's Italian, who speaks Hindi very well. She's able to get quite a bit of access to these Hatha Yogis just because she goes and hangs out for a long period of time and really gets to know them. So my research here, or my arguments here, really come out of Bevilacqua. And we'll read her essay for the next class session. So she argues, and this is absolutely true, anybody can practice this yoga, this Hatha Yoga, that has little sectarian or overtly religious regulations and contents. In practice, the texts were oriented toward Brahmin males, but you never knew where these yogis were going to come from. They were not all Brahmins. These days, there are still very few female practitioners of Hatha Yoga, though many women will practice some sort of secular yoga practices. So what do I mean by that? If you're hanging out with Hatha Yogis, there are women. There's not a lot of them, and Bevilacqua has found a couple of them and interviewed with them. There's not a lot of them, but there are some. When you go into a yoga studio, you see the majority of yoga practitioners are females. So it's gone from a male practice to a predominantly female practice, which is inherently interesting, at least to me. In India today, there are a lot of women do practice yoga, but they practice it outside of a Hatha Yoga practice, or only as a general yoga practice. And of course, women around the world do yoga in a secular, non-religious way. In modern postural yoga, practitioners are primarily female, as I've said, at any yoga studio, reversing the overtly male and misogynistic Hatha Yoga in India. And if you want to hear misogyny, listen to the way the Hatha Yogis talk about women. Women are poison. They'll only destroy you. They take your seed. Without your seed, you'll die. The yogic body is a male body. When they describe the body, it's a male body. Manipulation of the bindu is almost always semen. Some people will argue that women can also do this, and they call these uterine fluids retas. But I've never thought that the tradition works to really manipulate this. I've never seen texts that really explore this aspect of a female yogic body. Sorry, it's a misogynistic culture. It doesn't care about women. When traditional yogis are asked about modern postural yoga, Bevilacqua tells us, they know about it and they find it amusing and say it's good for people, but they're really not interested and they don't connect these practices to what they're doing. They see modern postural yoga as being like a sport. And in fact, they'll say that in Hindi. They'll say it's like, it's like yoga as sport, as opposed to yoga as a practice that gains liberation. So there's been little to no systematic ethnographic study of these yogis until Daniela Bevilacqua came out of the scene. Now, they're difficult to study, these Hatha Yogis are, because one has to get access with them and gain their trust, unless you become initiated like Malinson does. They don't want to reveal the secrets of their practices or their lineage. Furthermore, none of them speak English. And they can be violent and dangerous. I mean, I was always warned to stay away from yogis when I first went. I don't mind them now, but I know not to put my foot in my mouth. So it's really intriguing that, you can get access, but you just have to hang around. So this picture of Bevilacqua here driving an auto rickshaw is intriguing. She told me that she posed for this picture, but in fact, you see that yogi who's on the back, he had vowed to never sit down. So he's standing on the back because he's taken a vow to never sit down. He's like I don't know if I told you about this Nepali yogi I know called Kade Baba, because he always stands. He's always standing. That said, I've looked into his hut. He has a bed, he has chairs and whatnot, but anytime you see him, he's always standing. Okay, so Jim Malinson makes some really interesting article. He wrote a really interesting article recently that I read that I didn't have you read, that says that yogis sit around a lot. I mean, and he's like, says sitting around is actually kind of hard. He says that Malinson describes the most important activity is to do nothing. They do nothing. They perform their yoga practices and then they sit around and they hang around a fire. Now, in my experience, these fires are hot and the day is usually pretty hot and they give off a lot of smoke. But there's an idea that the smoke and the heat also helps increase their tapasya, their austerity. So part of their practice is to not do anything, to sit around after doing their yogic practices and, to smoke the chilam. They all smoke a lot of ganja. It's just in general. They always have from the Texan bag. And to just sit and do nothing and cultivate an attitude of doing nothing. Sort of like if you think about Jainism, how if you're doing nothing, you're not generating more karmas. There's something to it. So to get an understanding of the lives and practices, you have to grasp their full religious lifestyle. And Malinson writes about and talks about how he just started going to India, finding yogis, and he'd just go and sit around. And he'd say, it's not that easy to just sit and do nothing all the time in these kind of uncomfortable positions. But on the other hand, you get used to it and you get to like it. The Hatha Yoga that these yogis practice is not about any specific practices, for instance. They do a lot of things, but they cultivate a mental attitude. The purity of Hatha Yoga, the thing that's really important is intention. They do these practices to build a healthy body to support meditation. The goal is meditation, realization, and bodily immortality and magic powers. You get that by having a strong body that's doing these religious activities and these meditative activities and not going out and, getting a job and doing stuff and wandering around. So what is the goal? The goal is to be liberated, to get magic powers, to get bodily immortality. And how do you do that? By doing practices that help you do nothing. So go do some yoga. All right, I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.